Okay, Agriscience, welcome to a new week. We're going to start looking at some commodities and some crops that are typically grown and where they actually come from. To be honest, one of the only things that actually originated in the United States was corn. So a lot of the things that we grow and the things that we eat actually started in another country, and so they're indigenous to another place besides the United States. So we're looking at the origin of some of the major food crops, where they actually started, just to kind of get an idea of where our food resources that we have now actually began. And you can see that peaches actually came from China, so we got a lot of peaches that are grown in this particular area, especially once you get down into South Carolina. So, big area for peaches, but they actually originated in China, believe it or not. South America is where the tomato was originated, and it's kind of not a big surprise that a lot of the dishes that you have in the Latino culture actually are tomato based. And so you think about a lot of those dishes uh, using the resources that they had from the local lands. And so the tomatoes come from South America. Peru in South America are also going to be where the peanut comes from. That is not as big a crop in the United States as what it used to be, but most of your peanuts are grown in the South. They do pretty well in sandy soil. So, not a whole lot in Western North Carolina, but for sure in Eastern North Carolina. Most of our peanuts actually come from Georgia, though. Sweet potato, huge commodity in North Carolina. North Carolina actually usually ranks number one in the growth of sweet potatoes. We don't have a whole lot in Western North Carolina. Most of them are going to come from Eastern North Carolina, out in the sandy soils. My home county of Duplin County and its neighbor, Sampson County, two of the largest sweet potato producing counties in the entire nation. But those originally came from Central America. A lot of your grain crops, again, did not come from the United States. We do, corn originally came from Cuba and Mexico, but we do have corn that's indigenous to the United States. So, again, it's one of the only crops that actually is native to the United States. Soybeans came from Southwest Asia. We use a lot of soybeans in the products that we have these days. Soybeans are actually one of the most used crops worldwide. Cotton, a lot of cotton was began in Mexico and Africa and Pakistan. We don't grow nearly as much cotton as what we used to in the southern United States, but we used to have a tremendous amount of cotton growth, but we have really backed off on production in recent years. Wheat came from Southwest Asia, and most of the time when you think about wheat these days, you actually think about the Midwest and those grain crops that you see out in the Midwest. So, um, when we're looking at these major crops, a lot of where they're grown has to do with the climate. It has to do with the soil. And I mentioned a while ago that a lot of peanuts come from sandy soils, and a lot of sweet potatoes come from sandy soils. So a lot of it has to do with where the soil is fertile for a particular type of crop. And when you're looking at livestock, where's food available? Where can we market these particular types of things? What's the weather like? So, if you're looking at a crop like soybeans that has to have a lot of rain, you're probably not looking at growing a lot of soybeans in a place like Arizona where it's hot a lot and there's not a whole lot of rain. So, the regions and the crops that are produced in the regions are typically going to be based on the climate and what's available as far as the resources that are in a particular area. Just for instance, you've got citrus fruit, and we will have a big citrus sale later in the fall semester. And so, if you're a spring semester student, you dodged a bullet on having to do that one, but maybe next year. We have a big citrus sale, and citrus is typically not grown in our area because it just gets too cool. And I know that it doesn't seem like it gets terribly cold in the winter, but you're looking at places like Florida and Texas and California where it stays more temperate is going to be your major citrus producers. So it has a lot to do with weather. You can see this picture here with the big red blob on it. That is not a coronavirus map. That map is looking at the Corn Belt, which is where a lot of your grains are grown. And so most of your grains are going to be grown in that Midwest type area. I told you in another video that Mr. Harris and I had a chance to go to Iowa, and it was really interesting to just drive through that part of the country. Yes, we drove to Iowa 16 hours, but it was really interesting to drive through that part of the country. And it's kind of like when you go to the ocean, and as far as you can see at the ocean, is water. Well, when you're in that part of the country, a lot of, as far as what you can see to the horizon, is crops. And so it's much, much different than what we do here in Western North Carolina. So you're looking at most of the grains being grown in the middle part of the United States. And because of that, you actually have a lot of livestock that's being produced in that particular part of the country as well. So when we're looking at this map here, you can see this is a long time ago, but it still is. It's still accurate for today as well. You can see the counties that are going to produce the most grain in the darkest colors of green, and really you got a little bit of a tiny little bit tint of yellow right there on Cleveland County. So not a whole lot of grain produced in our part of the world, but most of your grain is going to be grown out in the Midwest. This particular picture. This is a satellite photo of, you can see there's, let's see, there's Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, and you got Iowa and Missouri. And so you've got all those Midwestern states. And this is a picture of those states in August. And this would be whenever you're still growing those crops, those wheat crops and corn crops and things like that. But then when we're going to fast forward to September, which is the very next month, which is another satellite photo of the same spot. Very, very green in August. It starts to dry out and get ready to be harvested by the next month. And so you can see just how much farmland there actually is in these Midwestern states, especially considering that, we don't have a ton of just farmland in Cleveland County as compared to what they have out in the Midwest. Some examples, you're looking at wheat. You've got the hard red spring wheat, which is going to be a high protein content. It's good for baking, and these are going to be grown out in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, Idaho. You've got your soft red winter wheat, which is where you're really looking at things like what we do. So your soft red winter wheat, if we have wheat grown in North Carolina, it's typically going to be this particular type. It's low protein as compared to what you get out in the Midwest, but it's really good for baking pastries and biscuits and cakes and things like that. And I'm going to make myself hungry, so I'm going to stop now. But this is what we typically grow in our area if we actually have wheat. I really don't know why the state of North Carolina thinks that you need to know about where spearmint is grown and why it's important to us if it's grown in Washington and Oregon and Idaho, but apparently they think it's important for you to know that. Floriculture crops. North Carolina is huge in floriculture crops. And so you wouldn't really think about it because you don't think about there just being flowers everywhere, but there are a lot of greenhouse businesses in North Carolina that help to provide flowers all across the country. One of them is Metrolina Greenhouses. If you get a chance, look up Metrolina Greenhouses. It's a pretty cool place. I've had an opportunity to go there a couple of times. They don't allow tours anymore like they used to. But the last time that I went was, gosh, it was a long time ago, many years ago. But at that particular point in time, they told us that the amount of space in Metrolina Greenhouses could fit Concord Mills Mall into the greenhouses 7 times. So that's how big those greenhouses actually were, and that was a long time ago. So North Carolina is actually really big in the greenhouse industry. And there's just a couple of pictures there of some wheat and there's the growth of wheat right there. So when we're looking at some of the animals, when we're looking at livestock production, look where a lot of the livestock are actually going to be raised. So a lot of our grain production is going to be out in the West and the Midwest. So is our beef cattle. Wonder why? Well, I mean, if you think about it, cows have got to eat. And so, since a lot of the grain is actually going to be produced in that Midwest part of the country, um, the the feed is right there for the animals to be able to eat. So that's why you don't see huge ranches in North Carolina the way that you see out in Oklahoma and Texas and places like that. And it's just because we don't have the amount of grain and land to be able to sustain these animals the way they do out in the West and Midwest. So most of your beef cattle is going to be produced where the feed actually is. It's not saying we don't have cows, we do, but our feed is going to be more expensive because a lot of it has to be hauled in. So more of your cattle is going to be out in the Midwest. Dairy, you're looking really in the northern part of the United States. And a lot of the reason for that, if you look Minnesota, Wisconsin, places like that, it's cooler weather. One thing, and you do have some dairy, a lot of dairy in California and places like that. But the thing about dairy animals is, and we notice it with our goats, is that as it becomes hotter, they produce less milk. And so when we first started milking our goats at the very beginning of milking season, when the babies were first born, we were getting probably close to 3 gallons a day. And now we're kind of pushing to get more than a gallon. We're kind of pushing to get 1.5 gallons. And it's just because it's so hot in North Carolina. And so when their production starts falling off, it's hard to get them to drink enough to keep that production up. So a lot of your dairy animals are going to be raised in these cooler climates where it just is not as hard on those animals' bodies. And you can see cattle and calves. This is a map that just kind of shows where most of the cattle and calves are going to be raised in the United States. Now, this one, and let's see, do I have? Yes, next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about pigs. Okay, so right now we have 8 pigs on campus. Not sure what things are going to look like in the spring. So if you're a spring semester student, we may not have 8 pigs. But we have 8 pigs on campus right now. The reason that we have 8 pigs on campus is because of this right here. You don't think about North Carolina being a big hog producing state because we don't see a whole lot of it in Western North Carolina. But where I grew up, which is, oh, where's my arrow? Right there. I grew up right about there in the middle of Eastern North Carolina. We have more hogs than people in my home county. And so North Carolina is typically going to be number 2 in hog production. Usually Iowa. I told you I went to a swine educators conference in Iowa. Iowa is number 1, and I don't foresee North Carolina surpassing Iowa anytime soon, even though you do have a very large concentration of pigs in the eastern part of the state. And that's just because Iowa is going to produce pigs all over the state and not just regionally like we do. But lots of hog farms out in the eastern part of the state. So the reason that we ended up with pigs, back to that, with this whole coronavirus situation, they were having issues with people in processing plants and just not being able to keep coronavirus out of the processing plants and keep people in their jobs being able to process the pigs. And so they were having a backlog of pigs that needed to be processed but had nowhere to go. And so a lot of independent farmers who were not contracted with a company, who weren't specifically growing for a particular company, but they just raised pigs and sold them to whoever was processing, they went out of business because they just didn't have anywhere they could take their pigs. And so in order for them to get rid of their pigs, a lot of them just sold them, and that's where we got ours from. It was either us purchase them or them have to euthanize them. And so, that's a lot of wasted product. And, it's kind of sad to think about having to, euthanize your whole farm. And so they sold pigs to anybody that would take them. And so we actually went and bought 50 pigs, brought them back to Cleveland County, and we sold some of them to some local people that wanted them, and then we ended up keeping a few of our own. So that's how we ended up with pigs, all the way from eastern North Carolina. So There's a little bit more information there about who leads in pig production. We also have poultry production in North Carolina and actually really big in Cleveland County. Probably our biggest agricultural commodity in the county is broilers, which is meat chickens. And most people here are going to grow for case farms. And so lots of people in this area producing broilers for case, or maybe even broiler breeders who are producing the babies that end up going out on farms. So lots of broiler production in North Carolina. When we look at North Carolina, different things are grown in different parts of the state just because mostly climate. The soil is much different in this part of the state than it is in the eastern part of the state. You can see here that Cleveland County is just on the edge of the Piedmont region right here. And so we do have some mountainous areas, especially up in the upper part of the county, but technically still part of the Piedmont region. But the weather and the soil are much different here than they are as you go eastward. And it's much different as you go westward. Not a ton different, but it's different, especially the weather piece. So it's kind of agriculture is based on weather and soil more than anything else. So if you're looking at the mountain counties, some of their biggest crops or some of their biggest commodities are Christmas trees. You know, pretty much every year the Christmas tree for the White House, or most years, comes from North Carolina because we have a ton of Christmas tree farms up in the mountains. Lots of apples. I love going up to the apple farms in early September up in Henderson County and picking apples or getting apples. There's a tremendous amount in that part of the world. And then trout. So you don't think about there being a whole lot of fish farming in Western North Carolina. You think about that being a coastal thing, but trout is actually does much better in cooler water. So it is a mountain commodity. In the Piedmont part of the state, you're looking at lots of greenhouse and nursery crops. Again, that's where that Metrolina greenhouse is that I was talking about earlier. Broilers are going to be produced in this part of the state. Turkeys, North Carolina typically ranks either first or second in the United States in turkey production, and dairy cattle. And most of your dairy cattle is actually going to be up kind of close to the Virginia border. In the eastern part of the state, this is kind of the biggest agricultural section of the state, and a lot of it just has to do with uh, the vast farmlands. As far as it's not as heavily populated, and you're looking at warmer temperatures and sandier soil, so it's easier to work with. The eastern part of the state, you're looking at hogs and turkeys. The largest turkey processing plant in the world is owned by Butterball, and it actually is probably about a mile from where I grew up. And so lots of turkeys in eastern North Carolina. There are some broilers, and it's getting to be a bigger industry out there. I grew up on a tobacco farm. There's not as much tobacco as what there used to be, just because it's not something that people are purchasing as much these days as what they used to, and so it's not as big of a market as what it was whenever I was a kid. But that's the way we made our livelihood whenever I was growing up. Sweet potatoes are big in Duplin and Sampson County. Lots of vegetables. And peanuts are typically going to be in the northeastern part of the state, kind of around the Outer Banks area, and then your typical crops: cotton, corn, soybeans, things like that. Now, this statistic is kind of old, and I probably should have gone in and updated it, but every year North Carolina takes in at least $10 billion in agricultural crops. It or agricultural commodities. It is North Carolina's largest employer. It is North Carolina's largest um, economic factor that we have. And so this is big business. So if you're looking at some sort of career in agriculture, there's lots of opportunities in North Carolina, all the way from the growth and production end to marketing to research. So lots of different opportunities in this state, a very wide variety of different types of things grown and raised in North Carolina. And that is it for commodities. And we will be back next time talking about some hot topics in agriculture and some things that are big in the industry right now.